So thank you first so much for the introduction and for inviting me here. I have not been here, but I've heard so many good things from our students who have gone to Augustana and also from our faculty that we've poached from you. So thank you for that, because they speak, volumes of good things about you guys. So I'm excited to be here today. I wish that I could talk about a more positive theme for you, but I hope that the significance of the theme outweighs the fact that it is rather depressing. As was mentioned before, what I specialize in is usually the ancient economy and specifically laws having to do with the marginalization of artisans and professionals. So how did I get from that topic and being somebody who is generally trained in epigraphy and Roman law to being someone who is writing about hate symbols? And that's a very good question that I hope that we can talk about first before we actually get into the symbols themselves. Yeah, that's great. All right, so there is a new age of classics, I think I can safely say, since about, I would say, early 2016, but really something that crystallized, you guessed it, around November 8th of 2016. And I think that it's important to realize that sometimes when you're in the midst of a movement or in the midst of a new age, it's very difficult for us to see it, right? When Petrarch kind of coined the term the Middle Ages, he was looking backwards from that period, which we would later call the Renaissance, the very beginning of humanistic ideas and philosophy that we would later describe as the Renaissance. But I think we can say that classics is having a moment right now, and that we're beginning to see that the kind of more conservative and traditional elements that oftentimes are seen as part of classics, whether they are or not, are being challenged by a lot of scholars within the profession itself, because of their appropriation, because of the appropriation specifically of Latin and Greek texts, and as we will see, symbols, in order to support a lot of movements that I think we can safely say are unsavory, that are about marginalization, that are about exclusion, and specifically oftentimes what we would call hate symbols. So I started blogging all the way back in 2011, if you guys could just give me a minute to give you my origin story. And I had just defended on April 1st of 2011, and then I didn't really have anything to do until graduation after I deposited my thesis, and so I wrote a reaction to the Hosni Mubarak overthrow in Egypt because they had decided that they were going to pass a law that said that all the images of Hosni Mubarak needed to be desecrated and taken down. And all the classicists in here will probably nod their heads and say, yes, 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 this is what we call, with a modern term, damnatio memoriae, but what we might call also memory sanctions. And so I just wrote an op-ed that I then gave to a professor who had an editor at the New York Times who published a parallel between damnatio memoriae and the desecration of images in modern Egypt. So that's kind of how it got started, and then I started tweeting, and I started the blog History from Below because I'm not really super interested about emperors or empresses or people at the very upper echelon of society. I'm much more interested in enslaved persons, in freed people, and just basic artisans and professional at the level that we would say are probably, the bottom rung of society within Roman civilization. And that blog then was picked up by Forbes. And particularly they loved pieces that I had written that were on things like chastity belts in Mad Max, and the fact that chastity belts actually weren't a thing that existed in the Middle Ages. They're a complete figment, something that was made up by Renaissance people as a way of showing what the Dark Ages were like. So I think that my editor really thought that he was hiring somebody to do lots of fun little pieces that were amusing to people, I had my best friend, Christina Kilgrove. We had both gone to UVA and we had both gone to UNC together, and she was writing for Forbes as well. And so I really kind of started in a very jovial manner in not thinking really much about politics, But as the 2016 election started to gain steam, people kept on asking me why I wasn't writing about politics and why I wasn't really engaging with the political milieu within which we were situated. And that was a very good question. I had heard for a long time that, you never will get a job if you talk about politics. You're never going to make friends if you bring politics into classics, right? Classics is not about politics. And all of us who do classics know that's ridiculous. Everything is politics. Everything is political because it comes from the word polis, city. If it has anything to do with the city, it is thus political. All of us have this kind of imagining of a world that is apolitical oftentimes when we look at certain parts of the past. But I would wager to you that almost everything that we have and come into contact with can be politicized and is political in some way. In any case, I began to think about what I should be writing and how I should be reacting to it, writing amusing pieces about medieval beards, for instance, and not really feeling fully satisfied with the fact that I was getting a larger and larger readership, but not really doing very much with that readership, except for giving people kind of vanilla pieces and top 10 lists. And then things began to change. I began to notice that a lot of the symbols that were very much associated with the ancient world, whether it be within the ancient Near East or Egypt or in Greece and Rome, were being appropriated and oftentimes weaponized following the election of Donald Trump. I think one of the biggest hints to me that things were beginning to change and that there was some appropriation of symbols that I was very familiar with, but perhaps the populace writ large was not, was when a tweet went out in July of 2016 to about almost 10 million followers that had taken a image originally put on 8chan, which is a interactive, let's say, dialogue online between a lot of alt-right groups. Use it a lot like 4chan in order to send memes back and forth and to interact with each other, of a image of Hillary Clinton. And the image, as I note here, is very much associated with anti-Semitism. It is trying to draw your eye to Hillary's association with Jewish people. My grandmother is Jewish, my maternal grandmother, and although I don't practice Judaism, I consider myself to be Jewish and also to be United Methodist, which is what I was raised as. I had written a blog post very recently where I talked about the fact that I got into classics in part because I wanted to learn more about my grandmother's heritage and how she had fled Russia with her sister during the pogroms in the early 20th century. In any case, we'll come back to why that blog post is important, but it was published just prior to a lot of this happening, and thus a lot of people recognized perhaps that I was partially Jewish. In any case, I started to think a lot more about how these symbols were coming into being, and then I began to notice posters going up across campus, not only at the University of Iowa, but at places like the University of Nebraska, what Sarah Palin might call like real America, right? This is to say land-grant institutions within the Midwest, which is oftentimes seen as the heart of conservative America. A lot of these posters that had sculptures on them, some of them were Renaissance, like the David, but inspired by classical sculpture, like the Apollo of the Belvedere, which you see right here, remember from the earlier slide on public classics. So I began to see a lot of these posters that were using classical imagery and a lot of sculpture. And then my husband and I kind of sat by idly in Iowa City watching a lot of our friends who still live in Charlottesville, Virginia, being terrorized the night before the Unite the Right protests that were occurring. So this is a scene from the Unite the Right protest right in front of the Rotunda, which is based off of the Pantheon, remember, in Rome. But they are carrying tiki torches. And my husband and I's anger, because we are both alumni of the University of Virginia, kind of bubbled over at that moment and broke me in half. My husband always had edited all of my Forbes pieces because they didn't give us copy editors. We had to copy edit everything and put it up. And so my husband, who is a professor and a librarian at the University of Iowa, and I both agreed that we needed to take a turn in terms of what I was writing about and to think a little bit more about how we could point out the fact that classics was being consistently cherry-picked in order to buttress hatred. And so that's really where this idea about a book, and really this is a series of articles that have been aggregated online through 3 different outlets, from Eidolon Journal, from Forbes.com, and then from Hyperallergic.com, which is where I currently write. I was a columnist for Forbes, but left Forbes for Hyperallergic because Hyperallergic is specifically a journal for social justice, and Forbes not as big of a fan of my work once I took a little bit of a turn, I will say. In any case, my editor remained supportive, but I could tell that we were having a fallout in terms of our ideological differences. In any case, I began to think about the field of semiotics, which is just a very fancy word for saying symbology or the history of symbols. Looking at how symbols are used and how they create a visual language that people speak through, and how that language can change over time. How semiotics is something that is very dynamic depending on the culture that appropriates it and then reuses it. And so today, in this talk, I really just want to focus on a few of those symbols and to talk to you about them, to get some feedback, hopefully at the end, and to help formulate the second book. The sophomore album is hard. It's the next book that you write after the very traditional academic monograph. But what I'm hoping is that this next monograph will be one that is much more accessible, but also cheap and easy for people, just regular people, to read, rather than only specialized classicists, which is a lot more what my first book was like. So today we're going to look specifically at probably some familiar symbols, symbols that maybe you already know some of the history of, and that's okay, particularly as a launching point for looking at symbols that you may not know as much about. We'll also look at the use of the torch as a symbol and how it is particularly used within the Roman Mediterranean and then within the modern world of the Third Reich. We'll look at the reuse and appropriation of the phrase Molon Labe, which you may have seen on a local pickup truck just yesterday, has become very popular. We'll look at the reuse specifically of white statuary and of the Discobolus, which was a favorite, particularly in Nazi Germany. Look at the history of something called the fasces, which gives us the word fascism today. And then finally, we'll end with looking at the use and reuse and misunderstanding of SPQR, Senatus Populusque Romanus. So these are just a few of them. I think that I could probably fill a book that was a dictionary of symbols that have been appropriated of probably 20 or 30, but I tried to whittle it down a little bit to, I think, the ones that are most prevalently used today. Okay, so let's start with the swastika, because I think that's probably a symbol that many of us have seen before and probably are very familiar with, and also one that evokes a lot of emotions in us. And that's something that's very important to people that study symbols, is how does this symbol make you feel? What does this mean? Right? Today, when we look at the swastika, I think most of us, particularly if we are not Nazis, feel feelings of fear, intimidation, hatred, marginalization. But this was not always the case. The swastika has about, by some counts, a 3,000 or 4,000 year lineage that goes all the way back to ancient India. And it's really within the context of Hinduism, even today, still a symbol of good luck and good fortune that's used by Hindus, Buddhists, and Jains even to this day. If you go to Hindu temples within India, you will see that the swastika is still regularly used as a sign of good luck, and its equality around all its points is something that is seen as very much a symbol of good fortune. Now, Greeks and Romans were also heavily influenced by the use of the swastika. And perhaps this was because of travels of people like Alexander the Great into areas of India. Perhaps it is because of heavy levels of trade in the Silk Road beginning in the 3rd century BCE. But we see particularly within Greek pottery and then within Roman mosaics that swastikas become incorporated as usually part of the meander pattern. And we all know this from every time that somebody tries to, show us a Greek restaurant or to kind of, wear a Greek outfit for Halloween. They always have that like blue meander pattern that is very recognizable as something that is Hellenic. Well, there was a modification of the meander pattern, and oftentimes Roman floor mosaics, which are very geometric oftentimes, would incorporate the symbol usually as something that was just geometrically and aesthetically pleasing, probably not trying to signal the same idea of good luck and good fortune that had been incorporated within Hindu culture. But it was popular among Romans and Greeks nonetheless. Now, let's fast forward to the swastika in the 19th and the early 20th century. It was something that was very much popularized because of visits by colonial Brits to India during the late 19th century. There was a fascination with the Orient, and that means China, and that means areas like Egypt, but it also means a fascination with India itself, and a lot more knowledge about Hinduism and Hindu languages. And so because the British loved it, of course Americans loved it too, because we love to appropriate a lot of culture and ideas from the British, and whatever becomes in vogue seems to oftentimes bleed over to us. And so a lot of American companies were also inspired to incorporate it as a symbol of purity. In other words, you would oftentimes see it on drinks like Carlsberg beer, which is the bottle is right there, or on Coca-Cola, as an indicator that this was good and pure alcohol, or good and pure liquid, right? This was something that was very popular, that people felt very comfortable putting these swastikas all over a lot of marketing campaigns at the time. What changes then is that we have Germans who are not only fascinated with India, they become fascinated with Sanskrit. In the 19th century, a lot of German researchers had posed the theory that Sanskrit and German influenced each other, that they had a common lineage in a divine group of warriors that were Aryan. This was hypothesized in the 19th century, but capitalized on by Hitler when he is formulating a lot of ideas of genealogy in order to explain the Aryan people and his ideas of the Aryan people within Nazi Germany. And one of the things he says is that Sanskrit and German have this common lineage of Aryan warriors, and thus the appropriation of this very early symbol within the culture of India should also be part of German culture and should represent purity within the German people, right? So we're kind of seeing how a lot of these early themes are weaponized and then being used to become symbols of hate by Hitler himself. So that is a brief recount of the swastika, and we will come back to a lot of these appropriations within the Third Reich over the course of the lecture. Okay, so now let's talk about torches. One of the things that supremely pissed me off about the Unite the Right march that took place in Charlottesville, Virginia, was that people thought that it was okay to joke about the fact that the men the night before had worn polo shirts to the local Walmart, which many of us who had gone there have gone to that same one, and purchased tiki torches instead of actual actual, I don't know, like large clubs that served as torches from Indiana Jones. I'm not sure. But they thought that it was hilarious that tiki torches had been purchased and then used in the Unite the Right March, as if this was somehow taking away from the symbolism of the torch, which is to say something that always has been used to insinuate that violence will happen. When I saw the torches the night before, and my husband did as well, I think both of us looked at each other and thought to ourselves that violence could only come that night and the next day. So whether or not they were tiki torches being bought at Walmart, or whether they were gigantic torches that were from Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, they're still there to insinuate the motivations and hatred of a certain group. And the reason that we should know this is because the history of the use of the torch is one that has always been of intimidation. Yes, torches have been used to light the way, and no, I'm not just thinking of that scene in Beauty and the Beast where Gaston is leading a group of torch-wielding people against the beast. There are many other historical examples besides that began to come to mind. First of all, fire in antiquity was something that was always a threat. If we know our Roman history, we know that the vigiles, that were the fire brigade of the Emperor Augustus, were something that were a new innovation for Rome, right? They had never actually had a fire brigade that was state-funded rather than privately funded, and we go back to that kind of trope of Crassus having a private fire brigade that he would watch people's houses burn down and then send a private fire brigade to ask if they wanted to either sell the property or for them to put the fire out. Seems like that has grown in terms of the theory around Crassus over time, so I'm not sure I fully believe it. But fire was always something extremely dangerous within Rome, during the Republic for sure, but also with the fire of Nero in 64. But the thing that came to mind for me were the events that happened after the Ides of March in 44 BCE. When Caesar was killed, probably near Largo, Argentina, which is a cat sanctuary today in Rome. He was killed, yes, I mean, it's kind of, when you go today, there are just like hundreds of cats, and then there's the spot where Julius Caesar was sliced. So, in any case, he dies on March 15th, but remember that we think that his funeral was 4 or 5 days later, probably on March 20th. And that's when Julius Caesar is laid out on a funeral pyre in the Roman Forum. And then, of course, Shakespeare, he inserts this idea of, you know, friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears, of Mark Antony, giving the funeral eulogy for Julius Caesar. What we don't get as much of a description of in Shakespeare, but is very prevalent in the ancient sources on that day, was that they had actually set up a second pyre in the Campus Martius, because you're not supposed to have cremations within the Palmarium in the city of Rome, that is to say within the sacred center of the city of Rome. And so they had set up the funeral bier, that is to say B-I-E-R, to carry him around and put him in the forum, but people had grabbed furniture, wooden furniture from all over the area of the forum and piled it up underneath the bier and given him an impromptu cremation in the middle of the forum. You're not supposed to have cremations within the city, and so this was very much extemporaneous emotion that was being expressed. And then a number of people, we're told, grabbed the sticks and the chair legs that were from the fire, and they ran to the houses of Cassius and Brutus and the other assassins as a group, carrying torches in order to insinuate that they were going to exact the same type of violence on the assassins of Julius Caesar that they had exacted on JC himself. So we have a number of examples of people wielding torches as a way of saying that violence is about to come. I think probably the most famous example, if you know your Bible, is the fact that Judas, when he leads the group of soldiers into the Garden of Gethsemane, he has them carrying their traditional weapons like a gladius, but they're specifically carrying torches into the Garden of Gethsemane in order to tell Jesus there will be violence unless you succumb to being arrested. And so I think that's a really clear example of it. Now, if we move on to the 19th and then the 20th century, we see that torches take on a particularly new meaning within American context first, before we get to the 20th century context. And particularly in the 1860s, when the Ku Klux Klan was formulated in Pulaski, Tennessee, that they take their name from the Greek word for circle, kuklas, right? This is allegedly how the etymology of the Ku Klux Klan comes about, their formulation of circles, and early on their use of firebrands and torches, along with later the appropriated hoods of the Ku Klux Klan in order to intimidate African Americans within the United States. Particularly, the torch would become much more popular because the Ku Klux Klan kind of goes out of fashion in the late 19th century and then comes back with a vengeance in the early 20th century, the use of fire at marches. But when we look at the Nazi use of torches, we see that Hitler saw torches as a connective tissue between the Germans of old and the Volkish race of Germans in his day. And he really saw this as purity that was embodied within the torch. As we'll see in just a little bit, the first torch relay that existed in the 1936 Berlin Olympics was created by Hitler as a way of connecting up the Germans within Berlin to the Greeks in ancient Olympia. The torch as a large static piece within the Olympics had existed for hundreds of years, but Hitler is going to institute specifically the torch relay that brings the torch fire all the way from Olympia to Germany. So his use of the torch at things like the Rockfenster here that you can see was a way not only of signaling the purity of the German people in the present and in the past, but also for showing intimidation and violence. So, in conclusion, torches, they're bad, they've always been bad. Okay, so let's look at the use of Molon Labe and try and translate this a little bit more. Molon Labe, as I kind of briefly mentioned prior, is something that has oftentimes become very popular today on the backs of bumper stickers that oftentimes get sold to gun owners. It is very much something that has become associated with the Second Amendment and with the right to bear arms, but it also has been increasingly appropriated on sites like 4chan and 8chan with the abilities of white people to hold on to their majority and their primacy within American culture. So as we're going to see, it oftentimes is associated with weapons, but it now has become more of a symbol within the alt-right for people being able to hold on to what they see as their heritage, their Europeanness going forward. Okay, well, where does this quote come from and how has it had an effect? Well, going back to the 2nd century CE, we have the writings of a biographer whose name is Plutarch, writing in Greek. This is a transliteration, of course, Molon Labe, of the actual Greek, which you can see inscribed on this Greek statue base. It was put up in, I think, the 1960s. In any case, Molon Labe was first written down by Plutarch in the 2nd century CE. So for those keeping track at home, that's about 500, a little over, close to 600 years after Leonidas dies. Okay, so was this an actual quote from the General Leonidas? I don't know. I can't tell you that. But the story that is connected to it is very interesting. Now, Spartan culture within the kind of cultural milieu has been strong, I think, for a long time. Not just the movie The 300 popularized Spartan culture and its militancy. We've seen that there was a focus on Spartan culture going all the way back to, for instance, the books that were imposed on West Point to be read by early West Point graduates. Had to read their Thucydides and had to read their Herodotus prior to graduation. In any case, Molon Labe becomes very popular in the 19th and in the 18th and the 19th century, in particular, because of people continuing to read Plutarch. In the year 1778, we have a citation that Colonel John McIntosh yelled, "Come and get it," to the British troops that were besieging the Fort Morris in Georgia during the Revolutionary War. But really, it comes into vogue as something that gets attached not only to people who are in the U.S., but also specifically to Texans in the year 1835 at the Battle of Gonzales. There had been a discussion and then later on a very big debate and fight over a group that had a cannon that belonged to the Mexican forces. And at the Battle of Gonzales, Mexican forces are besieging the town to try and get the cannon back. And apparently their battle flag and their battle saying had hastened back to Plutarch, and they had quoted, well, first they thought the Revolutionary War general, but in actuality the English translation of Plutarch, to say, "Come and get it," and then put the cannon up above it during the actual battle. This was a win for the Texans. And this was something that became very popular and still is when you go to Texas. So its appropriation by Second Amendment groups today, I think we can trace its lineage really back to Texas in the 19th century. But I want to also talk about not only the use of Spartan culture and of small laconic epithets in order to tie us back to Sparta. I want to talk about some more disturbing parts of Spartan culture that I think we should think about and really reject before we begin to celebrate Sparta as something that is to be upheld as, say, the ideal of masculinity and of militancy and the warrior that we all want to be. Because something that we don't often recognize, but probably should, about Sparta is their heavy investment in beliefs in what we would call social engineering or social eugenics. That is to say, the prioritizing of certain people within the Spartiate over those that, say, had a physical disability, those that perhaps looked deformed, those that didn't measure up to what Spartan ideals of beauty were. If you look at Spartan culture through the eyes of people like Steve Bannon, who were told by his screenwriting co-partner that his computer password was Sparta, that Steve Bannon oftentimes goes back to Sparta as the ideal of what America should be. And I guess I'm posing to you that if we really want to allow people to posit this to us and to embrace this idea that we should all be like Sparta, we should begin to see how insidious these ideas of eugenics and prioritizing one group of people over another that Sparta very much engaged in, and often, I think most historians would agree with me, led to its eventual downfall because of so many, Sparta had shrunk to such a small number of actual citizens as opposed to helots that were essentially slaves that worked the land outside of Sparta, that was very detrimental to Spartan culture. But I see a lot of the same themes and ideas and coded language that we speak about Sparta insinuating themselves into rhetoric from politicians like Steve King. Steve King, I know we're only an hour away from you at the University of Iowa, but Steve King feels very much like a black cloud that kind of lives over top of western Iowa. He is a congressman from the western portion of Iowa who very much believes in prioritizing babies and the fertility of white people who have a European heritage. He has a Confederate flag on his desk. He talks extensively about European civilization, and you guessed it, is a big fan of Sparta. I think it's dangerous not to point out the fact that people like Steve King use the narratives of people like Plutarch and antiquity in order to buttress their ideas that European blood should be prioritized. Okay, so we've talked about the use of aesthetic symbols, we've talked about the use of intimidating tactics, and now of the appropriation of texts. And now I'll talk about something that I've worked a lot on, which is the appropriation of sculpture in order to signal ideas and the creation of ideals of beauty. I've talked a fair amount in previous articles and talks that I've given on the Apollo of the Belvedere, which we'll look at in just a minute. But I think it's really important to see that white statues, as they are appropriated and used nefariously, particularly from the 18th into the 20th century, are not themselves inherently evil. Many times people have asked me if I think that white statues are racist. No, I do not. They are just very nice, pretty white statues. But the way in which we manipulate them in order to become a metric of cultural and ethnic beauty, I think is dangerous. And so I want to talk a little bit particularly about the Discobolus, because not only is it one of the most recognizable statues in history, it is one that has a rather sordid history that might be able to be a prism through which we can see how dangerous these ideals of beauty can actually be. Okay, so the Discobolus was one of the most popular means of sculpture within antiquity. We think that originally it was created by a sculptor whose name was Myron and was probably originally in bronze and made in the early 5th century BCE. And at that time, people thought it was the most realistic statue that embodied beauty, but also something that embodied a balance within the artistic execution of this sculpture. And it became so popular in its original form that we know that many other sculptors then sculpted that bronze Discobolus into marble. We also know of a few little miniatures. If you go to the Glyptothek in Munich, they have like little tiny grave miniatures of the Discobolus as well. It's kind of like Rodin's Thinker. You know, everybody has it on a keychain. Everybody can recognize what it looks like. It's kind of a very iconic statue in antiquity, but one that fell out of favor by early Christians. Early Christians were not as hyped up about the nakedness part of the Discobolus. The Discobolus had originally probably been created for a victorious athlete, because usually you get 2 statues when you're a victorious athlete. You get one in Olympia, and then you get another in your hometown to tell people that you've won. And so even though a lot of the ideas and the actual Discobolus itself had disappeared, we had references to the Discobolus in things like Pliny's Natural History. So we knew of its existence when in 1781, the first Discobolus, full Discobolus, not a miniature, was excavated on the Esquiline Hill in Rome. And that Discobolus is what we call the Lanceloti Discobolus. So this picture here is of the Lanceloti Discobolus as it is displayed today in Palazzo Massimo in Rome. But about 10 years after this huge discovery of this beautiful statue that was almost immediately associated with Myron, even though it was a Roman copy of the Greek original, was the discovery of another Discobolus, this time at Hadrian's Villa in Tivoli, which is right outside of Rome. And this one is called the Townley Discobolus. And if you've ever been to the British Museum, that's the Discobolus that they have. They have a different one, and his head is kind of shifted downwards, and it's because a curator kind of shifted it in the wrong direction many, many years ago. In any case, the Discobolus between 1781 and 1791, when they found these 2 very famous ones, begins to be kind of very iconic for this classical beauty that is really had come into vogue since the Renaissance, but was still very popular in the age of archaeology during the 18th century, when excavations at Pompeii had just begun. And so well into the 19th century, the Discobolus, people would travel from many miles away on their grand tours of Europe in order to go see the Discobolus itself. And that eventually led, when they restarted the Olympics in the late 19th century, to the use of the Discobolus on postage stamps, on iconography that was heavily associated with the Olympics, because this was the most famous sculpture of an athlete at that time that had survived. And so, of course, when the Olympics were held in Los Angeles in 1932, they put the Discobolus on their stamp. Well, another person, you guessed it, because I've already talked about him a lot, decided that he loved the Discobolus as well, and that he wanted to use it again to create this connective tissue between the beauty of Greek athletics and also his belief in a pure German people. Hitler did take a trip to Italy in order to see the Langladi Discobolus as it was being displayed. So he and Mussolini walked around together, and apparently Hitler kind of leaned over to him and said, "How much? Can you just give this to me?" And at first, Mussolini was very reluctant to sell the statue to Hitler, but eventually, I believe in 1937, Hitler eventually got the Discobolus and brought it to the Glyptothek in Munich to put it on display as his ideal for the German people. In the process, a number of Nazi films that were created between 1936 and 1938 began to use white statues as icons of what ideal white people, the Aryan people, should aspire to. And so I'm just going to, hopefully I can pull this up and show you just a little clip from a Nazi film from 1938, which is called Olympia. Okay. I hate pulling up films in the midst of it, because things always go very wrong. But let's see if we can do this. Okay, so this is the 1938 film that is, remember, 2 years after the Berlin Olympics in 1936. You guys recognize her with arms? Venus de Milo. Okay, so as the movie goes on, a number of statues are shown, and then German athletes appear from inside of the statues and break through to compete in the Olympic Games. So, literally, we have the statues fading into the white people that were seen as representing the ideal race by Hitler. Okay, so we have two more symbols that I want to look at here to try and figure out a little bit more about how the iconography of the past is really being appropriated for the present. Not just having the use of white statues now on alt-right posters for things like Identity Europa, but also the use of things like fasces on the shields at the Unite the Right rally. Something that caught my eye when looking at a lot of the iconography that have been placed on these very Spartan-like shields that were used at the Unite the Right rally were particularly these two bundles of sticks with axes in them that is probably immediately recognizable to anybody who does Roman history as the bundle of sticks known as the fasces. We know an incredible amount about the fasces, particularly from historians like Polybius and Livy, who talk about the role of magistrates within Roman history. I think maybe not all of us know the long history of violence that also is associated with the fasces, because as we'll see, during the course of the 19th and early 20th century, it came to symbolize justice and unity without the axe. But when magistrates had the axe inside of the bundle of sticks, it meant that they had the ability to have lictors. And for these lictors then to carry the fasces around and to be able to impose corporal punishment on anyone who stepped out of line. We have a number of depictions of fasces, and this is one from a coin from 54 BCE, struck by Marcus Junius Brutus, that Brutus who eventually will help to assassinate Julius Caesar. But at that time, the fasces was used as licit power, as a representation of corporal punishment through magisterial power. And we have a number of representations of the fasces on sarcophagi and on coinage. Really, its message, I would pose to you, has always been one that was heavily associated with the ability to beat someone, with the ability to impose actual physical violence on somebody else. The lictors are always threatening violence, but only very rarely do they pull the sticks out or the actual axe themselves and attack anybody that may be coming after the magistrate. But the theme of the fasces became very popular, particularly during the course of the Renaissance and into the 17th century, and was very much something that became part of the iconography of Roman power during the course of the 17th century. The fasces was then appropriated and used as a symbol of justice by the French revolutionaries in the 18th century, and they had a lot of personifications of the allegorical figure of justice using the fasces there. And probably the most famous use of the fasces, this one without the axe, you'll notice at the very top, is in the sculpture of Lincoln that was only put up at the beginning of the 20th century. Now, how this begins to change, this idea of the fasces as tied to legitimate violence enacted by the state, is when it gets appropriated and used by Italian fascists beginning in the 1920s and 30s. Because it had been such a heavy part of the iconography of ancient Rome, when Mussolini began to look towards the visual language of antiquity in order to think about what he could use in order to symbolize the legitimacy of the fascisti that were coming to power at that time, he began to appropriate the fasces from Roman coinage and from Roman mosaics and iconography, and to use it as his own symbol and also his own monogram. So oftentimes when you go through Rome, you will see that a lot of things that have the big Mussolini M have the fasces behind it. And so the fasces really got tied to fascism and the idea of a fascist ideology through Mussolini. Okay, so the last symbol I want to look at, and then I want to have a bit of a conversation about what all this means, is the appropriation and use of SPQR. Okay, so SPQR is something that means Senatus Populusque Romanos. It is something that really had been popularized in its long phrase rather than the abbreviation in the late Republic within writings of people like Marcus Tullius Cicero, who consistently talked about it as the way of describing the Republic writ large. But we begin to see much more of the use of SPQR on the coinage within ancient Rome. And yet, we have begun to see that within alt-right chat groups and within a lot of the iconography of the alt-right, they are beginning to take SPQR, which was a symbol of the Roman Empire, and to use a modification oftentimes of the aquila, that is to say the eagle that was put on the top of Roman standards, as a coded symbol for certain alt-right groups. This is a flag that was flown in Athens, Ohio by it was, I think, a local fraternity that flew it outside of their house. And then the police were called on them because people thought that they were flying an alt-right hate symbol. I think as it turns out, there's no evidence that that particular group actually had alt-right sentiments. It's just that they thought that they were flying just a cool SPQR flag. And the Athens police and the people that reported them did not understand whether or not they were actually just really into Rome or whether they were trying to signal to people that they were part of a hate group. But the coinage is really where we have the evidence for SPQR, because as an abbreviation, it gets appropriated and used by the Emperor Augustus specifically on his coinage as a way of tying himself back to the Republic. Because when Augustus refounds the Republic in 27 BCE and takes the name Augustus and abandons his old name of Octavian, he says that he continues to believe in SPQR, in the role of the Roman people, and he mints coins in order to show the Roman people that he is still very much tied to it. One thing that has been kind of difficult with my students is that SPQR oftentimes is seen emblazoned on military flags as part of what we call the vexillum, that is to say the flag that is carried with the standards into battle. We actually have no evidence that SPQR was ever put on a military flag. It was not a military, it was not something associated with the Roman military, it was something associated with the imperial house, which yes, they are the head of the executive and run it, but SPQR, as envisioned today, is not in fact what we have from the material evidence. So a lot of my students love to play video games, they love to play God of War, they love to play Assassin's Creed Rome, they love to play a lot of things about the ancient world, and we noticed that many of the vexillum flags that then later have been sold in Walmarts, I've seen them, in particularly armory shops, that they're very popular, have imitation Roman military flags that oftentimes have the aquila and then SPQR underneath it. When in fact we don't really think that they ever have. We don't know of any actual SPQR flag. But we do know that SPQR became very popular during the Renaissance as symbolic of ancient militancy and of ancient warriors. But as you guessed it, it became most in vogue as used in the early 20th century. Mussolini was not the first person to use it, but he was the one that popularized it on the manhole covers that you can see all over the city of Rome. Okay, so we've got SPQR being used as coded language for militancy, for a return back to European origins, for a symbol of purity and a Roman heritage that never really existed. And this is certainly the case for almost all of the symbols that we have looked at, is that we have taken a very common visual language, and we have seen that hate groups have appropriated it and used it to great effect. I think that the role of classicists who do not identify with these groups is not only to point at it and say, hey, you're misusing it, but to educate people about the history of these symbols and why they continue to be dangerous. I think when we use a visual language of hate, it can be the same as using actual epithets of hate, by calling people various names, by using marginalizing language. And so I see the need to get rid of these visual symbols, or to at least take away their potency from the people that are using them, as just as important of an endeavor as stopping people from using the language of hate. So as I put this book together, and as I start to get together a visual dictionary of how certain modern groups have begun to use the past, I'm really looking to you to see how I can better improve the way that I speak to them, to the public, and to try and take away some of the potency of this aesthetic language that has really been built over the course of the last few centuries. So thanks very much for listening, and I look forward to answering any questions that you have about it. Thanks. Yes, great.
Thank you so much for coming to speak with us. I was wondering if you could say a little bit about what you think would be the wrong way to strip some of these symbols of their potency. The reason why I'm asking this question is because I have my doubts about certain attempts to take back certain kinds of hateful language.
Oh, I'm not saying that I want to take it back for me.
Right.
Or for classics. I mean, I'm not out to like bring them back to classics because we own them. I don't think there is any ownership. I believe what Umberto Eco is saying, that really what I'm trying to do is not to take something back, but to render it impotent.
Yes, I wasn't saying that you had any agenda along those lines. I just think it could be helpful to maybe contrast your approach to other people's approach that might try to do something. Like, let's just say, for example, somebody learns about the origin of the swastika and has, let's say, like an earring, and an earring of the swastika, and says, well, actually, no, I'm trying to change people's minds about the origin of the swastika. It's really a Hindu symbol, right? I would contend that's the wrong way to try to strip it of its potency, right? So if we are trying to...
But if that person is Hindu, I think that's something you have to take into account.
Okay, sure. What I'm wondering is if one could identify a successful way of stripping a hateful symbol or term of its potency by contrasting it with unsuccessful approaches. That could be a way to go.
I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all. I cannot give you a full-on methodology for how to do it. I guess what I'm saying is I'm using knowledge in order to allow people to see this history of hatred so that we don't perpetuate it. I think that part of what we have to do is just to give people the language and the knowledge to understand where these symbols came from, and to say that a lot of the aesthetic language that is being used by alt-right groups and by hyper-conservative groups is itself a form of hate language, and not to perpetuate it by allowing that iconography to continue on. So for me, it's less about rendering it impotent by wearing it or by allowing it to go forward, but by simply isolating it and telling people why this creates fear and intimidation in people, and why it's a false construct to connect it back to antiquity. I don't think that classicists own antiquity. I don't think that we have any claim on it. We just know a lot about it. And so all I want people to do is to say, these symbols are creating fear. These symbols are creating ideas of marginalization and hatred. If we talk about their history of them and we isolate and call out the fact somebody has appropriated them, that's all I want people to do. I think that not wearing t-shirts with SPQR and the Aquila would help. I think that rejecting the wearing and the reuse of this type of iconography is helpful at this moment. I'm not saying forever you can never show and wear a Roman Aquila, but I think at this time, understanding the new aesthetic landscape that we're currently living in might be helpful, because this language is getting more and more prevalent, and I want us all to kind of understand it in order that we don't unwillingly or unwittingly perpetuate it. But yeah, I have no one size fits all. I would just suggest thinking about these things before you carry the tiki torch in a rally. You know, think about these things before you fly the SPQR flag. Think about these things. I think we can all agree, you know, not to fly a swastika. You still cannot do that in Germany. Remember, right after World War II, they banned all swastikas, and in 2007 they tried to make it EU-wide, and it was voted down, but it still was an attempt to get rid of the swastika. And I'm not saying that we have to get rid of all of these symbols, but right now I think we just need to be hyper aware of what it means as teachers and as students when we use this visual language. But yeah, I have no one-size-fits-all way of taking it back. I do not know. I think I just don't have the answer for that.
Sure.
But I would love it if somebody has a great plan. My plan is just to throw knowledge at people. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I'm curious, you pointed out the white statues, which of course originally were mostly painted, but many were.
As many people in this room know, I've talked about it ad nauseum, so I didn't talk about polychromy today. I mean, I've gotten a lot of hate mail that has pointed out that I have pointed that, and the Samantha Bee show, which is airing next Wednesday, is on polychromy, and I'm in it. So we went and looked at white statues together.
Okay, good. But my question is, how did the alt-right deal with bronzes?
They don't. Here's the thing: is cherry picking is a part of history that, in order to buttress our own theses and arguments, oftentimes we all do this rather innocuously. We cherry pick from the past in order to buttress an argument that we started with. And so what essentially a lot of the iconography of the alt-right has done is to ignore ancient bronzes and simply to use white statues as part of their iconography. And so yeah, I've never seen a bronze statue like the Boxer. I've never seen the victorious youth from the Getty. I've never seen any of the famous bronze statues like the Riachi bronzes, which were absolutely polychromatic. None of them I've ever seen on any kind of alt-right channel or chat group or anything. It's always white statues, because the thing is, we just want to point out that this is insidious cherry picking. Right? Those of us who know art history very much know that there were people of all different shades in the ancient Mediterranean. It was a very multicultural space, and yet the use of monolithic white marble in order to symbolize the past is a false narrative. Right? We know that there were sub-Saharan Africans, that there were Egyptians, that there were North Africans, that Septimius Severus was himself from Leptis Magna. Right? All of these things, but those people in this room who already know that, it's our job to really point that out, to be that person that's like, actually, comma. Yeah. But yes, I take your point that it's a false romance of the past, and I'm just here to like break up the romance. Yeah.
This would be kind of an interesting activity to go to on a forum or a rally and ask people what they think the symbols mean.
Right.
And ask, what do you think the fascist means? Because I bet none of them would know what it actually is supposed to be.
I agree, and I don't think that everybody who uses these symbols today, or everybody who paints the fasces, or every single person that uses SPQR, every single person that even uses Molon Labe, perhaps understands the way that it has been used recently. But I think becoming aware of it is the first step. So I will recount this briefly, but the way that Steve King uses the turn of phrase Western civilization is in order to support a white supremacist ideal. Okay? We have been teaching Western Civ since about the early 20th century. It was a course that was constructed in order to connect us to soldiers who were going to fight in World War I, to connect us to European ancestors. And so a lot of schools and universities, and University of North Carolina included, the first class I ever taught was called Introduction to Western Civ. That's rather innocuous on the face of things, but the way that the coded language of Western civilization is being used today, we have to call out, because people are continuing to use it and not recognizing that white supremacists use Western civilization as shorthand for saying white heritage and superiority, right? And so I'm not saying that everybody who says the word Western civilization is a racist, but I'm saying we all have to be much more culturally aware in this day and age than I think we used to have to be. Remember that back in like 2000 and, it was 2012 when we had that woman from Indiana who declared our living in a post-racial society. And I think we can all agree that we know that it's a very tense time right now. And so part of understanding the new aesthetic and the new vernacular of the alt-right is to know that when we use certain words and when we use certain symbols, they can signal things to people that we may not want them to. So I think you're right, they probably don't know. I don't think those kids in Athens, Ohio knew at all. But other people did, and they felt fear, and they felt intimidation. And we don't want that emotion for people to feel that, right? Yeah. Did somebody have a question?
So an argument that I often hear from alt-right circles in response to sentiments like yours is that it's infringing their freedom of speech, and that by saying that they can't use those symbols, it's censorship in a way. So I guess I'm sort of wondering what your counter to that would be.
Right, I can't take it away from them. And I agree that freedom of speech is something that exists and something that is very important. I don't think that I can take it away from them. All I can do is inoculate you guys with the knowledge that that is how they are using it, right? And that these symbols didn't always mean the same, and that Romans didn't use it in this way, or Greeks did not use it in this way, right? Because one of the things about classics is that we are a discipline that is 98% of tenured professors in classics are white, all right? That is sad, and that is horrific. And the only way that we're going to make classics more welcoming to people from all backgrounds, right? LGBTQ communities, from different ethnic backgrounds, from different races. The only way we're going to make it more welcoming is if we try and separate ourselves from being used by racists. Because classics has been used by racists since slaveholders in the American South, right? I mean, named all their kids Romulus and Remus and Amelia and Servilia and Livia. Right? Like this idea of a classical past as being used by racists and people in order to justify their ideas is one reason that classics is not oftentimes seen as welcoming to people of color. So I think you're right that it is freedom of speech, but if we're going to make classics welcoming to everybody, we have to at least stand up those classicists that believe this and say, we're not racist. We don't want them to be taking the stuff. We know about the stuff. Let us tell you about the stuff. But I've had many people of color tell me they don't want to take Latin, they don't want to take Greek, they don't want to take Roman history classes because they don't see themselves in the narrative. We have to change the narrative in order to make it more welcoming to people of color. Otherwise, it's just bullshit anyways, because the Roman Mediterranean was vast and large and multicultural. And so the only thing we can really do is to flip the script that has actually been, in regular usage now for hundreds of years in the US. I mean, classics being manipulated in order to justify modern supremacy of white males isn't just like in the last decade, you guys. It's hundreds of years of this happening. But yeah, we're not going to make classics any less white unless we stand up and say we welcome all people. Otherwise, the alt-right gets to take classics and make it completely associated with marginalization. So yeah, I agree we can't take it away from them, but classicists do have to stand up and then separate themselves from it actively, rather than the history of passivity in classics that we've seen for the most part over the past many years. Any other questions?
I could almost see, in fact, I recently read something from a person who studied medieval Europe. He was talking about the use of like knights and Knights Templar by Paul.
Matt Gabriel?
Mm-hmm.
He's my friend.
Oh, okay.
He's a professor at Virginia Tech. But,
Oh,
yeah,
okay.
we work in tandem because he now works for Forbes.
Oh,
We got him
nice.
that job.
Well, I was just curious if you saw any interplay between some of the medieval and some of the Roman uses of these.
Oh, yeah.
Of these,
Yeah. I mean, you guys can tell that I talk a lot, so I could have given a lot of other lectures, but classicists that are, there's a group of classicists called Classics and Social Justice, and I certainly work a lot with them, and then we have another group called Medievalists of Color, and that also includes allies of the Medievalists of Color, and so Matt Gabriel is part of that group, and all of us are working to try and point out every time Trump uses a medieval wall as a metaphor, every time he uses the Knights Templar, right? Every time the History Channel puts on a friggin' show about the Knights Templar, that's all just white people fighting for the Crusades, which is seen as, in the narrative of that the Crusades had to happen. It was reactionary, and it wasn't just that these Christians were attacking Islam. All of the times that these get appropriated, there are a number of groups working that are medievalists to try and do the same. So yeah, if you go to the Medievalists of Color, Medievalists of Color have their own website, and you can see that they've pointed out a lot of appropriation of the Middle Ages as well. But yeah, it's the same thing. We're trying to disconnect the connective tissue. All that connective tissue that I talked about with Hitler, it's time for us to sever it. It's time for us to just say it is no more. Because I study Romans not because I want to be like them. I study them because I'm fascinated by them. I'm not here to deify them or to worship at the altar of classics. I'm here to say, this stuff's cool. I like Latin. I like Greek. Everybody should. That's it. But yeah, medievalists are struggling with the same thing. So I think it's a fair point because, yeah, it's not just ancient history that's being cherry-picked. People think that the Middle Ages was all white too. And there are a number of Twitter accounts that are just dedicated to showing people of color depicted in the Middle Ages. So, other questions?
Maybe conclude with a thought that I often share with my students, which I think you agree with, which is the ancient world is a fascinating place, but you do not want to live there.
No, I completely agree. But I think that the alt-right and these hyper-conservative groups are into evangelizing, and they're into spreading an iconography that is not very fully understood, and I think the best weapon against that really is just for us to be informed, just for us to understand it, and for us to proselytize as much as they do that this is the true definition and idea behind the symbol that they are using. So thank you guys very much. I appreciate it.